Well, the vegetable lamb of Tartary is really the cotton plant, but it became associated with a group of plants I studied, the ferns, because a vegetable lamb was sent to Sir Hans Sloane at the British Museum, and he realized that this vegetable lamb was a fern, and he thought it was the source of the vegetable lamb legend. There was this legend that grew up in the Middle Ages about a half plant, half animal. And it became embellished throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And it was about a half plant, half animal that was tethered to the ground by its umbilical cord. And it evolved in this wild woolly legend. And what it is apparently Alexander the Great, his troops, when they went into India, they saw this plant. That was the first people in the Western world seeing cotton. And they saw this plant that had little white cottony tips, branch tips, and they described it the only way they could. They said it was a half plant, half animal. It was a vegetable lamb, and the little lambs were the white cotton balls at the tips of the branches. And that first report from Alexander's troops really got embellished and became the source of the vegetable lamb legend. And I think it was 1698 when Sir Hans Sloane was sent this vegetable lamb from some correspondent of his in northern India. He realized that this was a fern, but he thought this might be the source of the vegetable lamb legend. And so it became associated with the fern. And what it is, let me show you here. Here is one of the vegetable lambs. This is a fern. This is the genus Cibotium barometz. And this is the apex of the fern. Here you can see the legs here are the petioles or leaf stalks, and they've been bent in different shapes to form the legs of this vegetable lamb. They've used the fiddleheads, the young fern leaf in bud, for the tail and the two ears. And this golden hair that you see on it is the natural hair that protects the growing apex of the leaf and the young fiddleheads of the plant. People use these today in Eastern Asia. They'll pinch off some of the hairs and they'll put it on cuts or bruises, and it helps staunch the bleeding. But anyway, this was sent to Sloane, and he said, oh, this is the source of the vegetable lamb. So the vegetable lamb legend became associated with ferns. Much later, historians of science realized that it really wasn't the fern that was the source of the legend. It was the cotton plant. And but that's how it became associated with ferns.
When it was first recorded in the old world, in Europe, it was described almost always secondhand. People had heard the story from somebody who'd heard the story from somebody else. That out in Tartary, especially, there was this creature that was a chimera. It was half vegetable, half animal. To be precise, it was in the form of a lamb, but growing on a stalk as if it were a vegetable, stalk attached to its navel. And its life consisted of rotating around on this stalk, grazing the herbage within its reach. And when that had been exhausted, the barometz died. And the story was picked up in Europe in the late Middle Ages, really, and repeatedly told without a great deal of variation in the substance, which does suggest that it was being simply passed on from one storyteller to another. And in the end, not the end, towards the end, there was a suggestion being made to the Royal Society that the things which the travellers had seen could be explained by lots of little toys, which had been genuinely found by other travellers, which consisted of the carved roots of various ferns, sometimes Dixonia species, and made to appear like little animals, and the kind of thread-like rhizomes had the vague look of sheep's wool. And it was cracked, the problem of what this organism was in the 19th century by an English gentleman who, in a moment of inspiration, I think, but it may well have been in inspiration fueled by imperial ambition, thought that what they were talking about was the cotton plant. It filled the description well enough, though not the various side descriptions which were to do with the taste of the barometz, some sort of curious amalgam of shellfish most often, nor the fact that it occasionally made sounds. But in terms of a woolly-ish ball growing on a stem, it looked pretty likely that this was the culprit. And that's it. I mean, if you at that point say, okay, so it's a myth, therefore it's profoundly irrelevant and uninteresting, I think you need to get out more. It does seem to me a myth of extraordinary depth and resonance. The idea of chimera, of course, of hybrids between the vegetable and the animal kingdoms, is now increasingly validated by science, and I think probably intuitively understood by a lot of early people. The ecological resonance of that story, the continuity of the food chain, the fact that food resources can be exhausted, I find very potent as well. Now, maybe I'm reading my own or our own time's concerns back into the myth, but in order to survive, that myth had to have resonance for as far as I can tell, about 2,000 years of telling, of being told by people who almost certainly knew that it was a cotton plant, but still wanted to tell stories about it. And I think that my own view about myths is I share with people like Lewis Thomas and Richard Holloway, that the truth is irrelevant, or the accuracy is irrelevant. What matters is a deeper truth. Does the myth help us understand the world we live in better, underline those ways in which it's connected or fractious or whatever? And the vegetable lamb myth, to me, I would like to believe that it survived precisely because it underlined a lesson and perhaps a sympathetic feeling that all things living were connected.
Linnaeus accepted Sloane's argument that it was the fern was the source of the vegetable lamb legend, the barometz legend, and he named the species Cibotium barometz. So Linnaeus accepted that. The fern grows in southeastern Asia, and it's common. It's still used today. You can find these things in markets. The two that I have behind me, I don't know if you can see this other one here, but they came from Taiwan. And the plants are common. They're not, a small amount of them are harvested to make these things. They're not endangering the species by harvesting them. So they're still found today in markets. They belong to the family Cibotiaceae, and they are It's a small family of ferns, maybe about 8 or 10 species. There's not a lot of them. It does occur in the New World as well as the Old World, and taxonomically they're tree ferns, except these are tree ferns that don't have a tall trunk. They're just sort of a small, maybe half a meter tall at the most, but they're thick, massive trunks. Many ferns have scales, these hard, flat structures that protect the growing apex of the stem and the young leaves, the fiddleheads. This group is unusual in having hairs, these golden hairs that protect the growing apex and the young leaves. And that's what staunches the bleeding if you pinch them off and put them on a scrape or a cut. And I do want to emphasize, this is a plant, it's a fern. It does not produce flowers, fruits, or seeds. It was what Linnaeus put in the cryptogamia, the hidden marriage. They couldn't imagine how a plant would reproduce without flowers, fruits, and seeds, and they figured that the plant had to have seeds, but the seeds never appeared on the leaves or stems of the plant, so they thought it was a hidden marriage. And of course, Linnaeus thought that the flower was like a marriage. You had the petals and the sepals, and he likened those to the nuptial curtains on the marriage bed. And then you had the stamens, the pollen-producing organ of the flower, and those he likened to the husbands in the marriage. And the pistils, the seed and fruit-producing organ, he likened to the wives in the marriage. So you had this marriage there. And it produced seeds eventually. And ferns never did that. So that was a hidden marriage. They had to have seeds. How could plants reproduce without seeds? But it must have been a hidden marriage. And that's another interesting aspect, too, about Linnaeus, is that he thought that you had this marriage in the flower. And so that reproduction was going on, fertilization was going on between the husbands and wives in the same flower. And of course, today we know that is not the case. And really, Darwin broke that mold. He said, no, the general rule in nature is outcrossing. The pollen from one flower being transferred to the stigma on the pistil, the seed and fruit producing organ, of another flower on another plant. And that was a big criticism of Darwin's book when it came out, not The Origin of Species, but his work on pollinization. And he found that outcrossing was the rule. And this was a radical new idea at the time it came out in the late 1800s. Now, of course, today it's widely accepted. So you ask me about ideas that we may be carrying around in our heads that are completely wrong, and we may be thinking something like that. I think that would be a great example of an idea that we just commonly accept nowadays, but was quite radical, and that was the biggest criticism of his book on the fertilization of orchids and other plants when it came out in the late 1800s. Ferns reproduce by spores, tiny single-celled structures that are produced on the undersides of their leaves. And if you look on the underside of a fern leaf, you will see these dark lines or dots, and those are clusters of spore cases. And within each spore case is a tiny little spore. And when I mean tiny, I mean really tiny. These are maybe like the average fern spore is 35 to 50 microns long, and the average width of a human hair is maybe about 80 microns long. These are really tiny dust-like spores, and they are simply released from the underside of the fern leaf, and they're picked up in air currents, and they are dispersed long distances. So that's how ferns reproduce. And of course, in Linnaeus's day, they didn't know what this brown dust was being produced on the back of the fern. Was it equivalent to pollen? They had no idea. And that little spore, when it lands in a suitable environment, it will germinate, and it forms an entire plantlet of its own, an entire little fern plant. Now, it doesn't have roots, stems, and leaves like the plant we normally think of as a fern plant, but it's a fern plant in its own right, and it is usually a flattened structure. It grows flat on the ground, and that's the sexual phase of the plant. It produces the sex organs, the egg and the sperm. And that is the generation that gets pregnant, so to speak. You can have a self-fertilization, or you can have different gametophytes, these tiny little plants that develop from the spore. They can cross-fertilize and produce a new fern plant. After fertilization, you get a zygote. That zygote grows into an embryo, and that embryo keeps growing and developing into the plant we typically think of as a fern with stems, roots, and leaves. So that's the fern life cycle. And the angiosperms, the flowering plants, do it differently. It's a more complicated life cycle, but that's the way ferns do it. It's basically they're releasing spores from the underside of their leaves. Of these, you can see here on this pinna or leaflet, you've got these dark dots. And those dark dots are the sori. Again, they're clusters of spore cases that produce the spores. And in each one of those spore cases, there are typically about 64 spores. So, and there's hundreds of spore cases in each one of those dots. So there's a lot of spores reproducing this fern. And as they dry out, those spore cases release the fern spores, and those spores are picked up by air currents and dispersed very long distances away from the parent plant. And that's how reproduction is accomplished. One of the things about ferns is that they're very common on oceanic islands because they get out there easily. They're picked up by these air currents, easily dispersed long distances. And that's why ferns are so prominent in the floras of oceanic islands.